The heart monitor's shrill alarm pierced through the sterile silence of Mercy General's ICU as Dr. Harrison Wells watched the impossible numbers cascading across the screen. Michael Thompson had exactly 3 minutes to live. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Not after 14 months of aggressive treatment, not with his twin boys waiting in the hallway. Nurse Patricia Martinez dropped her clipboard, the metallic clang echoing through the corridor as other staff members froze mid-step, their faces draining of color. Code blue announcements had become routine, but this felt different, more final, more devastating. Sarah Thompson pressed her trembling palm against the observation window, her wedding ring catching the harsh fluorescent light as she remembered Michael teaching their boys to ride bikes just 2 years ago, back when cancer was just a word in someone else's story. "Get that dog out of here immediately," Wells commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos even as his hands shook, betraying his clinical facade. What happened in the next 52 minutes would challenge everything the medical team thought they knew about healing and force them to question whether miracles could come with 4 legs and unwavering loyalty. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 14 months earlier, Michael Thompson had been the kind of man who fixed his neighbors' broken fences without being asked and coached Little League on weekends. At 45, the former Army sergeant still maintained the disciplined posture that had carried him through 2 tours in Iraq, his weathered hands telling stories of service and sacrifice that he rarely shared, even with Sarah. The pancreatic cancer diagnosis had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a young oncologist who looked barely old enough to drive, let alone pronounce death sentences. "Stage 4, the doctor had said, as if those 2 words could summarize the collapse of everything Michael had built. Sarah had gripped his hand so tightly, her knuckles went white, while 16-year-old twins Jake and Ryan sat in the waiting room, still believing their father was invincible. Rex had been Michael's constant companion since the diagnosis, a 7-year-old German shepherd whose intelligent brown eyes seemed to understand things that humans missed. The dog had arrived at their Scottsdale home 5 years earlier, a retired military working dog looking for a quiet life with a veteran who spoke his language. What the adoption papers hadn't mentioned was Rex's uncanny ability to sense trouble before it happened, how he'd pace restlessly before Michael's pain flares, or refuse to leave his side on particularly difficult days. Sarah Thompson had spent 22 years as an elementary school teacher, her patient demeanor serving her well in classrooms full of rambunctious third graders, but nothing had prepared her for watching her husband's strong frame diminish week by week, or for the mounting stack of medical bills that arrived with clockwork precision. The initial estimate of $200,000 had seemed impossible. The current total of $847,000 felt like a cruel joke from a universe that had already taken too much. Dr. Harrison Wells ruled the oncology ward at Mercy General with the precision of a Swiss timepiece and the warmth of Arctic wind. At 58, he dedicated 3 decades to fighting cancer, earning a reputation for brilliant diagnoses and rigid adherence to protocol. His colleagues respected his expertise. His patients feared his bedside manner. What they didn't know was that Wells kept a small photograph in his desk drawer. An 8-year-old boy with gap-toothed grin and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Dreams that had ended 12 years ago in a neighbor's backyard when a pit bull's territorial instincts had proven stronger than a child's innocent approach. Nurse Patricia Martinez had seen enough military families pass through these halls to recognize the particular brand of quiet strength that Sarah Thompson carried. At 52, Patricia understood the weight of watching someone you love slip away while maintaining a brave face for children who needed their remaining parent to be unbreakable. Her own son had come home from Afghanistan in a flag-draped coffin, teaching her that some battles couldn't be won with love alone, but love was still worth fighting for. The financial crisis had crept up like cancer itself, invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere, metastasizing through their savings, their retirement funds, their children's college dreams. The morning of October 15th began like any other in the oncology wing, with the soft hum of machines and the quiet shuffle of nurses beginning their rounds. Michael had arrived for his scheduled chemotherapy session at 6 a.m., Rex padding silently beside him through the hospital corridors, despite the early hour protests from security guards who had grown accustomed to the unusual pair over the past year. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Nurse Patricia called out, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness that medical professionals perfected after years of delivering hope in measured doses. "Rex looks alert today. How are you feeling?" Michael settled into the familiar recliner, the worn leather creaking under his diminished weight. "Like I'm about to let poison drip into my veins for the 100th time," he replied, with the dark humor that had become his coping mechanism. Rex immediately positioned himself beside the chair, his massive head resting on Michael's lap with the precision of long-established routine. At 8:30 a.m., while Michael dozed fitfully under the influence of pre-medications, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message that would shatter what remained of their carefully constructed normalcy. The foreclosure notice had arrived at their Scottsdale home, delivered by a process server who had apologized before handing Jake the official papers. Her twin sons, mature beyond their 16 years, had photographed the document and sent it to their mother with a simple message: "We need to talk." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the legal language that translated to 60 days before they would lose the house that had sheltered their family for 15 years. The house where Jake had taken his first steps, where Ryan had built elaborate Lego cities in the living room, where she and Michael had slow danced in the kitchen on countless Sunday mornings. The equity had been consumed months ago by medical bills, but seeing it in black and white felt like watching their life's work crumble in real time. By 10 a.m., the insurance denial letter had arrived via certified mail, a cold, bureaucratic rejection of the experimental treatment that represented Michael's last realistic hope for remission. The insurance company's medical reviewer, someone who had never met Michael, had determined that the proposed immunotherapy was investigational and therefore not covered under their policy. The cost, $75,000 for a 3-month trial, might as well have been $75 million. Sarah found herself in the hospital chapel at noon, not because she was particularly religious, but because it was the only place in Mercy General where crying was considered appropriate. The small room smelled of lemon polish and fading flowers, with afternoon sunlight filtering through stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns on worn wooden pews. She had held herself together for 14 months, playing the role of optimistic wife and protective mother. But the foreclosure notice had finally broken something essential inside her. "Lord, I don't ask for much," she whispered to the empty room, her voice echoing off stone walls. "I just want my husband to see his boys graduate. I want one more Christmas morning, one more anniversary dinner. I want to grow old with him, even if old means 60 instead of 80. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in their Scottsdale home, Jake and Ryan Thompson were having the kind of conversation that should have belonged to adults. They had discovered their parents' financial records while searching for important documents, uncovering a paper trail of desperation that revealed the true cost of keeping their father alive. "We have to do something," Jake said, his voice cracking with the strain of premature responsibility. "Dad would kill us if he knew we found out, but we can't just sit here while they lose everything." Ryan nodded, his usually carefree demeanor replaced by grim determination. "I already talked to Coach Martinez about getting more shifts at the sporting goods store, and Mrs. Chen said she needs someone to walk her dogs after school." The twins had made their decision without consulting anyone, quietly withdrawing from their advanced placement classes and college preparatory programs to free up time for part-time jobs. They told their guidance counselor it was a temporary adjustment, but both boys understood that their original plans for attending Arizona State together were evaporating like desert rain. Back at the hospital, Rex had begun exhibiting behavior that would later seem prophetic. The German Shepherd refused to leave the parking lot after Michael's treatment session ended, circling the family's Honda Civic with increasing agitation. When Sarah tried to coax him into the car, Rex planted himself firmly on the asphalt and looked directly at the fifth-floor windows of the oncology ward. "Come on, boy," Michael called weakly from the passenger seat. "We'll be back tomorrow." But Rex knew something the humans didn't. Deep in his canine instincts, he could sense that tomorrow would bring a crisis that would test every bond that mattered. The afternoon shift brought an unwelcome visitor to Michael's room in the form of Dr. Harrison Wells himself, his white coat pristine and his expression carved from granite. At 2 p.m. sharp, Wells stood in the doorway like a sentinel, his pale blue eyes immediately fixing on Rex, who had somehow managed to slip past security and was lying peacefully beside Michael's bed. "Mrs. Thompson," Wells said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in medicine. "I need that animal removed from this facility immediately. We've discussed this multiple times, and hospital policy is non-negotiable." Sarah looked up from the financial paperwork she'd been attempting to organize, her eyes red-rimmed from crying in the chapel. "Doctor, Rex isn't hurting anyone. He's been coming here for months, and your own nurses have commented on how much calmer Michael is when—" "Hospital policy exists for patient safety," Wells interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Animals carry bacteria, they're unpredictable, and they have no place in a sterile medical environment. I don't care if he's the most well-behaved dog in Arizona." Michael stirred in his bed, the conversation pulling him from the drowsy haze of chemotherapy medications. "Doc, with all due respect, Rex has been better for my recovery than half the pills you've prescribed. He knows when I'm having a bad day before I do." Wells's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle twitch that Nurse Patricia had learned to recognize as a sign of barely controlled emotion. She had worked with Dr. Wells for 8 years, long enough to understand that his rigid adherence to protocol wasn't just professional preference. It was personal armor against a world that had already proven too cruel for comfort. "Patricia," Wells said without taking his eyes off Rex, "please call security and have this animal escorted from the premises." If the Thompson family cannot comply with basic hospital regulations, perhaps they would be more comfortable seeking treatment elsewhere. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire, impossible to ignore and potentially devastating. Patricia Martinez had seen this dance before, Wells pushing families to their breaking point when his control was challenged, patients forced to choose between their doctor's expertise and their own instincts about what brought them comfort. "Dr. Wells," Patricia said carefully, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone she'd perfected during her years as a military wife. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately. I believe there are some circumstances about this particular case that might warrant consideration." Wells turned his attention to the veteran nurse, recognizing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. Patricia had earned his grudging respect through years of competent care and unwavering advocacy for her patients, but even she couldn't convince him to bend rules that existed for reasons too painful to explain. In the small conference room adjacent to the ICU, Patricia closed the door and faced the man who had saved hundreds of lives, but couldn't save himself from his own guilt. "Harrison, I know about Tommy." The name hit Wells like a physical blow, his carefully maintained composure cracking just enough to reveal the raw wound beneath. 12 years had passed since that September afternoon, when his 8-year-old son had climbed over the neighbor's fence to pet their new pit bull, 12 years since Wells had performed CPR on his own child in the back of an ambulance. 12 years since he'd failed at the one medical emergency that mattered most. "Don't," Wells whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't use my son's name to justify breaking protocol." Patricia stepped closer, her maternal instincts recognizing a man still drowning in grief that had never properly healed. "That family is going to lose everything. Their house, their savings, their father's life. And you're worried about a dog that's been nothing but a comfort to a dying man? That dog could bite someone, carry disease, cause an allergic reaction." Wells recited the litany of concerns that had become his mantra. "Tommy thought he was just petting a friendly animal, too. Rex isn't a pit bull, Harrison. He's a trained military working dog with more discipline than half the medical residents in this hospital. Michael Thompson served 2 tours in Iraq. Doesn't that earn him the right to have his companion nearby while he's fighting the battle of his life?" The mention of military service struck another nerve, one that Wells had tried to bury beneath years of civilian medical practice. He had served as a field medic in the early days of the Iraq War, before medical school and oncology fellowship and the comfortable distance of hospital administration. He had saved lives in conditions far less sterile than Mercy General, working alongside military dogs that detected explosives and provided comfort to soldiers facing death daily. Wells walked to the conference room window, looking out at the Phoenix skyline shimmering in the afternoon heat. "There was a soldier," he said quietly, his voice distant with memory. "Sergeant Thompson. I think IED explosion, massive internal bleeding. We worked on him for 6 hours in a field hospital that was basically a glorified tent. His dog wouldn't leave his side, kept trying to get to him during surgery." Patricia felt her breath catch as the pieces began to align. "Harrison, what was the soldier's first name?" "Michael," Wells whispered, the word carrying the weight of recognition. "Sergeant Michael Thompson, 82nd Airborne. We saved his life, but barely. He kept asking about his team, about getting home to his wife and the twins they were expecting." The silence in the conference room stretched between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Patricia watched as Wells processed the connection, his rigid stance softening as the abstract policy violation transformed into a deeply personal recognition of debt and duty. "The same Michael Thompson who's dying 3 floors above us," Patricia said gently. "The same man whose dog you want to ban from the hospital where you're trying to save his life for the 2nd time." Wells closed his eyes, feeling the weight of cosmic irony pressing down on his shoulders like desert heat. The revelation in the conference room left Dr. Wells staring at his reflection in the window, watching the ghost of the young field medic he'd once been superimposed over the rigid hospital administrator he'd become. Patricia waited patiently, understanding that some transformations required silence to take root, like desert flowers that bloomed only after rare rainfall. "I remember his voice," Wells said finally, his words barely audible above the hum of the hospital's ventilation system. "He kept saying, 'Tell Sarah the boys are going to be fine,' over and over, even while we were pushing blood into him faster than his body could process it. He was more worried about his pregnant wife than his own survival." Patricia moved closer to the window, watching Wells wrestle with memories he'd buried beneath years of professional detachment. "What changed your mind about animals in hospitals, Harrison?" "It wasn't just Tommy, was it?" Wells let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 12 years. "After Tommy died, I couldn't stand the sight of dogs. Any dogs. I transferred to oncology because cancer was clean, predictable. No sudden attacks, no betrayal of trust. Just cells behaving badly and treatments that either worked or didn't." "But that's not the whole truth," Patricia pressed gently, recognizing the careful omissions of a man who'd spent years constructing protective narratives. Wells turned from the window, his pale eyes reflecting a pain that had never properly healed. The night Tommy died, there was another dog at the emergency room, a therapy dog visiting the children's ward. I watched that golden retriever comfort a little girl who was recovering from surgery, and I wanted to strangle it with my bare hands. How dare it exist when my son was gone? How dare it bring comfort to other children when it couldn't save mine? The confession hung between them like a bridge over an abyss, 12 years of carefully maintained anger finally given voice. Patricia had counseled enough grieving families to recognize the particular guilt that came with survivors' rage, the shame of resenting innocent creatures for the crime of continuing to exist. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Sarah Thompson was discovering that their financial situation had deteriorated beyond even her worst estimations. The anonymous call from their mortgage company had delivered news that the foreclosure proceedings would accelerate due to missed payments spanning 6 months. The representative, probably reading from a script, had suggested they contact a bankruptcy attorney. "Bankruptcy," Sarah whispered to the empty hallway, testing the word like a foreign language. 22 years of marriage, of building credit and saving for retirement and teaching their children the value of financial responsibility, reduced to a legal declaration of failure. She found herself walking toward the hospital's business office, driven by a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might offer a payment plan that didn't require selling organs on the black market. The billing coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Janet with kind eyes and worry lines, listened patiently as Sarah attempted to negotiate with mathematics that refused to bend. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your situation and I wish I could help more," Janet said, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered impossible news daily. "But with outstanding charges approaching $900,000, the hospital's policy requires significant down payments for any extended payment arrangements." 900,000. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the fluorescent light seem suddenly too bright. "I thought it was 847,000 last week." The experimental immunotherapy consultation, even though insurance denied coverage, still generated charges for the specialist's time and diagnostic procedures. Plus, there are facility fees, pharmacy costs, and the upcoming surgical consultation that Dr. Wells recommended. Sarah laughed, a sound devoid of humor that echoed off the sterile walls of the business office. Surgical consultation for a man who might not live to see Christmas. Do you understand the irony in that, Janet? Janet had been working hospital billing for 15 years, long enough to understand that medical debt destroyed more families than the diseases themselves. She'd seen proud people reduced to begging, watched retirement savings evaporate like morning dew, observed children forced to choose between college and keeping their parents alive. "There is one option," Janet said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "Sometimes, in extreme cases, we receive anonymous donations targeted toward specific patients. It's rare, but it happens." "Anonymous donations?" Sarah's voice carried a mixture of hope and skepticism that had become her default emotional state. "Usually from former patients or their families, sometimes from staff members who've been touched by particular cases. The donations go into a fund that the hospital administration can access for compassionate care situations." Sarah felt tears threatening again, the constant proximity to emotional breakdown that had become her new normal. "How does someone qualify for something like that?" Janet's computer screen reflected in her glasses as she pulled up Michael's account, scrolling through months of charges that told the story of a family's financial destruction in cold, clinical detail. Dr. Wells would have to approve any compassionate care funding. He makes those decisions personally. The irony was so sharp, it could have cut glass. The same doctor who wanted Rex banned from the hospital held the key to their financial salvation. Sarah wondered if the universe was playing an elaborate joke or if some cosmic force was testing her capacity for hope against increasingly impossible odds. Back in the oncology ward, Rex had begun exhibiting behavior that concerned even the staff members who'd grown fond of his presence. The German shepherd paced restlessly between Michael's room and the hallway windows, his intelligent eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for threats that humans couldn't perceive. "He's been like this for 2 hours," reported Maria Santos, a nursing assistant who'd taken particular interest in Rex's welfare. "Won't eat, won't settle down. It's like he's waiting for something." Nurse Patricia had seen enough military working dogs during her husband's deployment to recognize signs of alert behavior. Rex wasn't just restless, he was responding to stimuli that existed beyond human sensory perception. Dogs could detect changes in barometric pressure, subtle shifts in human pheromones, even electrical variations in the nervous system that preceded seizures or cardiac episodes. "Has anyone checked Mr. Thompson's vitals in the last hour?" Patricia asked, a cold finger of intuition touching her spine. Maria hurried to Michael's room, returning with a printout that made Patricia's experienced eye narrow with concern. "His heart rate's been climbing gradually since noon. Blood pressure's up too, and his oxygen saturation is starting to fluctuate." Patricia studied the numbers, recognizing the subtle pattern that often preceded serious complications in chemotherapy patients. The medications that fought cancer cells also stressed healthy organs, creating a delicate balance that could shift without warning. At 4:30 p.m., while Sarah was still trapped in the business office's bureaucratic maze and Dr. Wells was confronting his own demons in the conference room, Jake and Ryan Thompson made a decision that would have horrified their parents if they'd known about it. The twins had spent their lunch break at Phoenix Pawn and Gold, a shabby storefront that specialized in converting desperate circumstances into cash. They'd brought Jake's guitar, a Martin acoustic that Michael had given him for his 15th birthday, along with Ryan's gaming laptop and their shared collection of baseball cards that had been accumulating value for years. "You boys sure about this?" asked Eddie, the pawn shop owner whose weathered face had seen too many families forced to sell pieces of their lives. "These are quality items. Might want to think it over." "Our dad's dying," Ryan said simply, his 16-year-old voice carrying weight that shouldn't have belonged to someone his age. "We need the money for medical bills." Eddie counted out $1,200 in 20s. A fraction of the item's actual value, but enough to make a small dent in the family's crushing debt. The boys signed the paperwork with hands that shook slightly, understanding they were trading pieces of their childhood for a few more days of their father's life. "You got 90 days to buy these back," Eddie said gently, recognizing the sacrifice he was witnessing. "I'll hold them as long as I can, okay?" Jake and Ryan walked out of the pawn shop carrying an envelope of cash and the peculiar combination of pride and grief that came with making adult decisions in teenage bodies. They'd already calculated that their part-time job wages, combined with this emergency infusion, might cover groceries and utilities for another month. Neither boy mentioned the acceptance letters they'd hidden in their bedroom dresser, full scholarships to Arizona State University that they'd planned to surprise their parents with after their father's recovery. The scholarships had deadlines, and those deadlines were approaching like storm clouds on a clear horizon. By 6 p.m., the convergence of financial crisis, medical emergency, and emotional breakdown had created a perfect storm that would test every relationship in the Thompson family's orbit. Rex's agitation had intensified to the point where he was whimpering constantly, a sound that cut through the hospital's ambient noise like a knife through fabric. Dr. Wells emerged from the conference room looking like a man who'd undergone spiritual surgery without anesthesia. Patricia walked beside him, her presence both supportive and watchful, understanding that some transformations were fragile and required careful tending. "I want to see the Thompson file," Wells said quietly. "All of it, medical records, billing history, insurance correspondence, everything. Patricia nodded, recognizing the tone of a man preparing to make decisions that would have consequences far beyond hospital policy. "Harrison, are you sure you're ready for this?" Wells paused at the elevator, his reflection multiplied in the polished steel doors. "I've been running from dogs for 12 years, Patricia. Maybe it's time I stopped running and started remembering why I became a doctor in the first place." At 11:47 p.m., the universe finally stopped pretending that Michael Thompson's story might have a gentle ending. The cardiac monitor's peaceful rhythm, which had been his mechanical heartbeat for 14 months, suddenly erupted into the frantic chaos of ventricular fibrillation. Rex, who had been lying beside the bed in vigilant silence, shot to his feet as if struck by lightning, his massive body trembling with an urgency that needed no translation. "Code Blue, room 5117. Code Blue, room 517. The announcement echoed through Mercy General's corridors like a death knell, pulling Dr. Wells from his office where he'd been reviewing Michael's file with the intensity of a detective studying evidence. The financial records had painted a picture of systematic destruction, a middle-class family being consumed by medical costs that would have bankrupted multimillionaires. Sarah had been dozing in the uncomfortable visitor's chair when the alarms began shrieking, her dreams of better times shattered by the sound that every cancer family learned to fear. She watched in horror as nurses flooded into the room, their practiced efficiency turning the peaceful space into a battlefield where Michael's life hung in the balance. "His heart stopped," announced Dr. Jennifer Park, the night shift cardiologist whose calm voice belied the gravity of the situation. "We need to get him to the cardiac unit immediately." Rex began barking. Not the casual woofs of a pet seeking attention, but the deep, urgent commands of a military working dog who had found his mission. The sound cut through the medical chaos like a siren, impossible to ignore and clearly communicating that something beyond normal protocol needed to happen. "Someone get that dog out of here!" shouted Dr. Park, her hands already moving to prepare defibrillation equipment. "We can't work with an animal in the room," but Rex refused to budge. The German Shepherd planted himself beside Michael's bed with the immovable determination of a soldier following orders that superseded all other authority. His brown eyes, normally gentle and patient, now burned with an intensity that made several nurses step back involuntarily. Sarah found herself caught between grief and desperation, watching medical professionals fight for her husband's life while simultaneously trying to remove the one creature who had brought him comfort through the darkest months. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was addressing the doctors, Rex, or whatever cosmic forces controlled such moments. "Please don't take him from me." Dr. Wells arrived at the room like a man walking into his own reckoning. The scene before him, a dying veteran, a frantic wife, a loyal dog refusing to abandon his post, crashed through 12 years of carefully constructed emotional barriers. Suddenly he wasn't standing in a sterile hospital room but in a desert field hospital, working frantically to save a young sergeant who kept asking about his pregnant wife and the twins they were expecting. "Dr. Wells," Nurse Patricia called out, recognizing the internal battle playing out across his features. "What are your orders?" Time seemed suspended as Wells stared at Rex, seeing not a policy violation, but a creature whose loyalty transcended regulations and whose presence had somehow stabilized Michael's condition for months. The dog's breathing was deep and rhythmic, as if he was trying to share his own life force with the man who had become his pack leader. "Let him stay," Wells said quietly, his voice cutting through the medical chaos with unexpected authority. Everyone step back and let the dog approach the patient. Dr. Park looked up from the defibrillator controls, her expression incredulous. "Doctor." "Wells, hospital policy clearly states—" "I'm changing hospital policy," Wells interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "This is my patient, my department, and my decision. The dog stays." What happened next would be discussed in medical journals and hospital corridors for years to come, though no scientific explanation would ever adequately capture the profound simplicity of what unfolded. Rex approached Michael's still form with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar, his massive head lowering until his nose touched Michael's chest directly over his heart. The German Shepherd began breathing with deliberate, exaggerated rhythm, deep inhalations followed by slow, measured exhalations that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. His chest rose and fell with metronomic precision, as if he was trying to teach Michael's body how to remember the basic function of staying alive. "Look at the monitor," whispered Maria Santos, her voice filled with awe that bordered on reverence. The chaotic squiggles of ventricular fibrillation began to show signs of organization, random electrical impulses slowly coalescing into something that resembled a heartbeat. Michael's oxygen saturation, which had plummeted to dangerous levels, started climbing with incremental but steady progress. Dr. Wells found himself holding his breath as he watched the impossible unfold before his trained medical eye. Rex maintained his position with unwavering focus, his breathing becoming even more pronounced, as if he was pouring his own vital energy into his beloved human. The dog's eyes never left Michael's face, conveying a depth of communication that transcended species barriers. "His blood pressure is stabilizing," reported Nurse Patricia, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell was being cast. "Pulse is weak but regular. Brain oxygen levels are returning to normal ranges." Sarah pressed herself against the wall, watching through tears as her husband's loyal companion performed what could only be described as a miracle through sheer force of will and love. Rex's breathing had become so synchronized with the medical equipment that it seemed as if the dog had become part of Michael's life support system. For 52 minutes, Rex maintained his vigil without moving, without wavering, without acknowledging anything except his determination to keep Michael Thompson tethered to life. The medical staff worked around him with growing respect, checking vitals and adjusting medications while the German Shepherd continued his extraordinary intervention. Dr. Wells stood at the foot of the bed, watching a scene that challenged everything he thought he understood about healing and medicine. The rigid protocols that had governed his practice for 3 decades seemed suddenly inadequate compared to the pure, uncomplicated love radiating from a dog who refused to let his human die. "In 30 years of medicine," Wells said quietly to Patricia, "I've never seen anything like this. It's as if he's sharing his own heartbeat." Patricia nodded, her own eyes moist with tears she hadn't realized were falling. Dogs don't think about what's impossible. They just love with everything they have and hope it's enough. At 12:39 a.m., exactly 52 minutes after the cardiac episode began, Michael Thompson's eyes fluttered open. His first sight was Rex's concerned face hovering inches from his own, the dog's tail beginning a tentative wag as he recognized consciousness returning to his beloved human. "Hey, boy," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying enough strength to make Rex's entire body tremble with relief. "Did you save my life again?" The question hung in the sterile air like incense, acknowledging what everyone in the room had witnessed, but no one could quite explain. Rex licked Michael's cheek once, gently, then slowly lowered himself to the floor beside the bed, his mission accomplished, but his energy utterly depleted. Sarah rushed to her husband's side, her hands shaking as she touched his face to confirm he was really there, really breathing, really looking at her with the love that had sustained them through 22 years of marriage. "Michael, we thought we'd lost you." "Not today," Michael replied, his fingers finding Rex's head and stroking the soft fur with profound gratitude. Rex wouldn't let that happen. Dr. Wells approached the bed with the humility of a man whose certainties had been thoroughly rearranged. "Mr. Thompson, your vital signs are stable, but we need to understand what just happened here. This type of recovery from ventricular fibrillation is extremely rare without aggressive medical intervention." Michael's eyes found Wells's face, and something passed between the two men. Recognition, perhaps, or the kind of understanding that only existed between people who had faced death together and emerged changed by the experience. "Sometimes healing comes from places we don't expect, Doc," Michael said softly. "Sometimes love is the best medicine we have." Rex had closed his eyes, his breathing shallow but peaceful, like a soldier finally allowing himself to rest after completing the most important mission of his life. The victory celebration lasted exactly 18 hours before the universe demanded its payment in full. Rex, who had seemed merely exhausted after his extraordinary vigil, began showing signs that something fundamental had shifted inside his 7-year-old body. By the evening of October 16th, the German shepherd, who had breathed life back into Michael Thompson, could barely lift his massive head from the hospital floor. Dr. Amanda Chen, Mercy General's consulting veterinarian, arrived at the hospital with the grim efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. She had been called in emergencies before, but never to examine a dog who had apparently performed medical miracles in an ICU. Rex lay motionless beside Michael's bed, his breathing shallow and labored, his normally bright eyes clouded with exhaustion that went beyond simple fatigue. "When did you first notice the change in his behavior, Doctor?" Chen asked Sarah, her hands moving gently over Rex's body as she conducted her examination. The dog's tail managed one weak wag at her touch, but the effort seemed to drain what little energy he had remaining. Sarah knelt beside Rex, her hand stroking his fur with the tenderness reserved for family members facing their final moments. "He's been getting tired more easily for the past few months, but we thought it was just the stress of spending so much time at the hospital. He's been so focused on Michael that we didn't notice." Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly grave as her examination continued. She could feel the swollen lymph nodes, the enlarged spleen, the subtle but unmistakable signs of a body under siege from within. "I'm going to need to run some blood work, but I'm concerned about what I'm finding." The portable X-ray machine arrived 30 minutes later, operated by a technician who had heard about Rex's heroic intervention and approached his work with unusual reverence. The images that emerged told a story of silent suffering that made everyone in the room catch their breath. "Osteosarcoma," Dr. Chen announced quietly, pointing to the telltale shadows on Rex's shoulder and hip bones. "Bone cancer, quite advanced. Based on the extent of the lesions, I'd estimate he's been fighting this for at least 6 months." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of impending loss. 6 months? But he never showed any signs of pain. He never limped, never complained, never stopped taking care of Michael. Dr. Chen had seen this phenomenon before in working dogs, their training and loyalty overriding natural responses to pain and illness. Military dogs are conditioned to suppress signs of distress. Their mission comes first, always. Rex was probably experiencing significant discomfort, but his dedication to Michael superseded everything else. Michael, who had been listening from his hospital bed with growing horror, struggled to sit up despite his own weakened condition. "You're telling me that while I was feeling sorry for myself about cancer, Rex was fighting the same battle and never said a word." "Dogs don't understand self-pity," Dr. Chen replied gently. "They understand love, loyalty, and duty. Rex saw his job as protecting you, and nothing, not pain, not illness, not his own mortality, was going to stop him from completing that mission. The irony was devastating in its completeness. While the Thompson family had focused all their energy on fighting Michael's cancer, Rex had been waging his own private war against the same enemy, never asking for sympathy or special treatment, never drawing attention away from the human who needed care. Dr. Wells, who had remained silent throughout the veterinary examination, finally spoke with a voice that carried the weight of professional and personal understanding. The effort he expended last night, maintaining that level of physical and emotional intensity for 52 minutes, it would have been like running a marathon while having a heart attack. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the full scope of Rex's sacrifice became clear. He knew, didn't he? He knew he was dying, and he used everything he had left to save Michael. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, her own eyes moist with the emotion that came from witnessing absolute devotion. Based on the progression of his cancer, Rex probably has days, not weeks. The stress of last night's intervention likely accelerated his decline significantly. The room fell silent except for Rex's labored breathing and the steady beep of Michael's heart monitor, the sound that Rex had fought so desperately to preserve. Jake and Ryan, who had arrived at the hospital after receiving their mother's frantic phone call, stood in the doorway, absorbing the cruel mathematics of love and loss. "It's not fair," Ryan whispered, his 16-year-old voice cracking with the strain of processing tragedy layered upon tragedy. "Dad gets better, but Rex dies. How is that fair?" Jake, always the more analytical of the twins, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe Rex knew Dad needed to get better so we could take care of Rex now." The observation carried a wisdom that surprised everyone in the room, including Jake himself. The family had spent 14 months focused on Michael's survival, but now they were being called to shepherd Rex through his own final journey. Nurse Patricia, who had witnessed the entire drama unfold, approached Rex with the gentle competence that had made her invaluable to countless families facing impossible decisions. "What do we need to do to keep him comfortable?" Dr. Chen began explaining palliative care options for dogs with advanced cancer, but her words were interrupted by Rex himself. The German shepherd had summoned enough strength to raise his head and look directly at Michael, his brown eyes conveying a message that needed no translation. "He wants to know that his job is finished," Michael said softly, understanding flowing between man and dog with the clarity that comes from years of mutual devotion. "He needs to know that I'm going to be okay." Michael eased himself out of bed, despite the protests of medical staff, his weakened legs barely supporting his weight as he lowered himself to the floor beside Rex. The dog's tail managed a few feeble wags as Michael gathered him into an embrace that encompassed years of shared mornings, quiet evenings, and the particular bond that existed between a soldier and his most trusted companion. "You did good, boy," Michael whispered into Rex's fur, his voice breaking with emotion that had been building for months. "You saved my life more times than I can count. You kept me going when I wanted to give up. You showed me what loyalty really means." Rex pressed his muzzle against Michael's chest, over the heart that he had fought so desperately to keep beating. The gesture was gentle but firm, a final confirmation that his mission had been completed successfully. Dr. Wells watched the scene with the expression of a man whose understanding of medicine had been fundamentally altered in the span of 24 hours. The sterile protocols that had governed his practice seemed inadequate compared to the profound healing he was witnessing between a dying dog and his human. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Wells said quietly, "I want you to know that effective immediately, I'm implementing a new hospital policy regarding therapy animals. Rex has shown us something that medical textbooks can't teach, and other families deserve the same comfort and healing that he provided. Sarah looked up from where she knelt beside her husband and dog, her face streaked with tears but illuminated by something that resembled hope. "You mean other dogs like Rex could help other patients?" "I mean that love comes in many forms, and healing happens in ways that science doesn't always understand," Wells replied, his voice carrying the conviction of recent conversion. "Rex has taught us that sometimes the best medicine isn't found in a pharmacy." The hospital room had become a sacred space where the boundaries between human and animal, doctor and patient, policy and compassion had dissolved into something larger and more meaningful. Rex's breathing grew shallower as the evening progressed, but his eyes remained alert and focused on the family he had protected with such fierce devotion. As midnight approached, marking exactly 24 hours since Rex had saved Michael's life, the German Shepherd's breathing finally began to slow. His work was finished, his mission completed, his love proven beyond any possible doubt. The family gathered around him, understanding that they were witnessing the end of a story that had redefined their understanding of loyalty, sacrifice, and the mysterious ways that healing could manifest in the darkest hours. At 3:17 a.m. on October 18th, Rex took his final breath surrounded by the family he had protected with unwavering devotion for 5 years. His passing was as gentle as his life had been purposeful. No struggle, no distress, simply a peaceful transition from guardian to memory. Michael held the German Shepherd's head in his lap, feeling the moment when Rex's spirit finally released its hold on a body that had given everything in service of love. "He's gone," Michael whispered, his voice carrying the particular grief that comes from losing a creature whose loyalty had never wavered, whose love had never demanded anything in return except the privilege of being needed. Dr. Wells, who had remained in the hospital through the night, despite having no medical obligation to do so, stood witness to Rex's peaceful departure with the expression of a man whose fundamental understanding of healing had been irrevocably changed. The rigid protocols that had governed his 30-year career seemed suddenly inadequate compared to the profound lesson in love and sacrifice he had just witnessed. "I need to tell you something," Dr. Wells said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a confession that had been building for hours. "Something about your medical bills and something about Rex that changes everything we thought we knew about what happened here." Sarah looked up from where she knelt beside Rex's still form, her eyes red with tears, but alert to the gravity in Wells's tone. The past 72 hours had contained more emotional upheaval than most families experienced in years, but something in the doctor's demeanor suggested another revelation was approaching. "The anonymous donations that have been paying your medical bills," Wells continued, his pale eyes meeting Michael's with the directness of someone finally ready to bear witness to truth. "They weren't anonymous. I've been covering your treatment since the day I realized you were the sergeant I saved in Iraq 15 years ago." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on the hospital room like desert heat. Michael stared at Wells with growing recognition, memories of a young field medic's face gradually superimposing themselves over the features of the man who had become his oncologist. "The IED explosion outside Fallujah," Michael said slowly, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with almost audible precision. "You were the medic who worked on me for 6 hours. You kept telling me stories about your son to keep me conscious." Wells nodded, his professional composure finally cracking to reveal the emotional core that had driven his actions for months. "Tommy was 8 then. He wanted to be a veterinarian, loved every animal he met. I talked about him because I could see you fighting to get home to your family, and I thought stories about mine might give you something to hold on to. But Tommy's the son who—" Sarah began, then stopped as the full tragedy of coincidence became clear. "The son who was killed by a dog 4 years later," Wells finished, his voice steady despite the pain that still lived in every syllable. "After Tommy died, I couldn't bear the sight of animals. I thought they were unpredictable, dangerous, a threat to the people I was supposed to protect. When I recognized you as my patient, I felt responsible for keeping you alive, but I couldn't overcome my fear of dogs." Michael's hand moved protectively to Rex's still form, understanding flooding through him as the complex web of guilt, debt, and redemption finally revealed itself. "You've been paying our bills because you felt responsible for me. I've been paying your bills because 15 years ago you asked me to tell Sarah that the boys were going to be fine," Wells replied. "You made me promise to make sure your family would be okay if you didn't make it home. When I found you here, fighting cancer with the same determination you showed in that field hospital, I knew I had to honor that promise." The revelation recontextualized everything: Wells's rigid enforcement of animal policies, his personal interest in Michael's case, his presence during Rex's final vigil. The doctor who had seemed like an obstacle had actually been a guardian angel, fighting his own demons while secretly ensuring that Michael's family wouldn't be destroyed by medical debt. "How much?" Sarah asked quietly, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Everything," Wells replied simply. "The $847,000 in medical bills, the foreclosure payments to save your house, the college fund I established for Jake and Ryan. I couldn't save my own son, but I could honor the promise I made to yours." Jake and Ryan, who had been silently absorbing the adult conversation with the particular intensity of teenagers forced to mature too quickly, looked at each other with expressions that mixed gratitude, confusion, and the peculiar guilt that comes from receiving gifts that feel too large to accept. "Dr. Wells," Jake said carefully, his voice carrying a maturity that shouldn't have belonged to someone his age, "why didn't you tell us? We've been working part-time jobs, selling our stuff." "Because healing isn't just about money," Wells interrupted gently. "Your family needed to fight this battle together, needed to discover what you were willing to sacrifice for each other." The financial stress was real, but it was also revealing something beautiful about who you are as people. Ryan pulled out his phone, scrolling to a photograph that made him smile despite the gravity of the moment. "We sold Jake's guitar and my laptop to help with bills, but we were planning to surprise Dad with something else." The image on Ryan's screen showed 2 official letters: full academic scholarships to Arizona State University, awards that the twins had earned through academic excellence and community service, acceptances they had planned to reveal when their father was healthy enough to properly celebrate. "We never doubted Dad would get better," Ryan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "We just wanted to make sure we could help the family while he was fighting." Michael felt his heart swell with pride that temporarily overwhelmed even his grief over Rex's death. His sons had faced their family's darkest hour, not with despair, but with determination, not with self-pity, but with sacrifice that honored everything he had tried to teach them about loyalty and responsibility. But Wells wasn't finished with his revelations. From his jacket pocket, he produced a small digital recorder and a manila envelope that looked as if it had been handled frequently over the past several days. "There's something else," Wells said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something Rex left behind that changes our understanding of everything that happened." He opened the envelope and removed Rex's collar. Not the simple leather band that the family had seen daily, but a sophisticated piece of equipment that had been hidden beneath a fabric cover. Embedded in the collar was a small digital recording device, military-grade technology that had been documenting sounds and conversations for months. Rex wasn't just a retired military working dog, Wells explained as he activated the playback function. He was specifically trained as a medical alert animal. "Michael, you arranged his training 6 months after your cancer diagnosis, didn't you?" Michael's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching sheepishness as the truth of his secret preparation was revealed. I knew the cancer was going to get worse. I knew there would come a time when I might not be able to tell when I was in medical trouble. So I had Rex trained to detect cardiac episodes, respiratory distress, changes in my blood chemistry that might indicate crisis. Sarah stared at her husband with a mixture of amazement and exasperation that perfectly captured 22 years of marriage to a man who planned for every contingency. "You taught our dog to be a medical device and didn't tell me?" "I didn't want you to worry more than you already were," Michael replied, his hand still resting on Rex's fur. I figured if something happened, Rex would alert the medical staff and everyone would assume it was just good instincts." Wells pressed play on the recorder and Rex's voice filled the room, not barking or whimpering but the deep, rhythmic breathing that had characterized his final vigil. But underneath the breathing, barely audible, was something else. Rex's heartbeat, recorded through sophisticated sensors in his collar, revealing the extraordinary effort he had expended during Michael's cardiac crisis. His heart rate during those 52 minutes never dropped below 180 beats per minute, Wells explained, his voice filled with awe at the data. He was in cardiac stress the entire time, pushing his cancer-weakened body far beyond safe limits to maintain the breathing pattern that kept you alive. The recording continued, and Sarah realized she was listening to the sound of absolute love, translated into biological terms, a dog's heart working overtime to save his human, despite the knowledge that such effort would hasten his own death. "He knew," she whispered, understanding finally dawning. Rex knew he was dying, and he chose to spend his last strength saving Michael. "More than that," Wells replied, checking his notes from the data analysis. The pattern of his breathing, the precisely timed intervals. Rex was performing a sophisticated form of respiratory therapy that we typically see only in trained medical professionals. He wasn't just comforting Michael, he was actively treating his cardiac arrhythmia through controlled breathing techniques. The revelation transformed Rex's final act from inexplicable miracle to deliberate medical intervention, performed by a creature whose training and love had combined to create something approaching the supernatural. He had been not just a loyal pet, but a four-legged physician whose dedication to his patient had been absolute. 18 months later, the Rex Memorial Garden at Mercy General Hospital had become a place of pilgrimage for families who understood that healing sometimes came in forms that medical textbooks couldn't explain. The garden occupied a quiet corner of the hospital grounds, designed with winding paths that allowed for contemplation and a central fountain where children could splash their hands while parents processed the weight of medical diagnoses and treatment plans. Michael Thompson stood beside the bronze statue of a German Shepherd at the garden's heart, his frame filled out again with the robust health of a man whose cancer had remained in remission for over a year. The statue captured Rex perfectly, alert and protective, with intelligent eyes that seemed to watch over every visitor who sought comfort in the memorial space. "He would have loved this," Sarah said, joining her husband at the statue with their newest family member, a 10-week-old German Shepherd puppy named Hope, who was already showing signs of the intelligence and devotion that had made Rex so extraordinary. All these families finding peace here because of what he did. The Rex protocol had transformed Mercy General from a hospital that banned animals to a pioneering center for animal-assisted therapy. Dr. Wells, whose professional reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by his radical policy changes, now oversaw a program that paired trained therapy dogs with patients facing the most challenging medical battles. The waiting list of families requesting animal companions had grown to over 300 names. Jake and Ryan, now juniors at Arizona State University on full academic scholarships, visited the garden regularly during their breaks from classes. They had used the money from their part-time jobs not for family survival, but for a cause that honored Rex's memory, establishing a scholarship fund for veterinary students who wanted to specialize in therapy animal training. "Dad, you need to see this," Jake called out. approaching the fountain with a manila envelope that carried the official seal of Arizona State University's veterinary program. The first Rex Thompson Memorial Scholarship recipient just got accepted. Michael opened the envelope to find a letter from Maria Santos, the nursing assistant who had first noticed Rex's alert behavior during his final vigil. Maria had left her hospital job to pursue veterinary medicine with a focus on training therapy animals for medical facilities. "I owe my career change to watching Rex save your life," Maria's letter read. "He showed me that healing comes in many forms, and I want to spend my life training other animals to provide the same comfort and medical support that Rex gave to your family. Thank you for making this possible." The letter was accompanied by a photograph of Maria with a young golden retriever named Tommy, a tribute to Dr. Wells's son that had been Maria's idea, a gesture of healing that had moved the former oncology chief to tears when she'd told him about her choice of names. Dr. Wells himself approached the garden with the measured pace of a man who had learned to savor moments of genuine happiness after years of existing in professional detachment. At 60, he looked younger than he had during the crisis that had changed all their lives, his face softened by the peace that came from finding purpose in unexpected places. "Michael, Sarah," Wells called out, his voice carrying warmth that would have been unimaginable during their first difficult encounters. "I have some news that I think you'll want to hear." Wells had been carrying a thick folder of documents that he placed on one of the garden's stone benches with ceremonial care. "The American Medical Association has approved our petition to establish animal-assisted therapy as a recognized treatment modality. Mercy General's Rex protocol is being implemented in hospitals across the country." The announcement carried implications that extended far beyond their personal story. Families facing medical crises would now have access to the kind of comfort and healing that Rex had provided, transforming one dog's act of love into a legacy that would touch thousands of lives. "There's more," Wells continued, his expression mixing professional pride with personal satisfaction. "The insurance companies have agreed to cover the costs of trained therapy animals for patients with documented medical need. What Rex did here has literally changed how we think about healing." Sarah felt tears forming as she considered the scope of change that had grown from Rex's simple act of love. Families would no longer have to choose between medical protocols and emotional support. Trained therapy animals would become part of the treatment plan rather than obstacles to overcome. Hope, the puppy who was already showing remarkable intuition about human emotions, wandered over to a young girl who was visiting the garden with her grandmother. The child, probably 7 or 8 years old, was wearing the telltale headscarf that indicated chemotherapy treatment, but her face lit up with pure joy as Hope settled beside her with the gentle confidence of a natural therapy dog. "She's starting her training next month," Michael explained to the girl's grandmother, who was watching the interaction with the particular gratitude of someone who understood how rare such moments of simple happiness could be during medical treatment. "Hope will probably be working in the children's oncology ward by Christmas." The grandmother's eyes filled with tears as she watched her granddaughter giggle at Hope's playful antics. "My Emma has been so scared about her treatments. She keeps asking if she's going to die like her grandfather did. But look at her now. I haven't seen her smile like this in months." Michael knelt down beside Emma, his own experience with cancer giving him a special understanding of the fear that lived in the hearts of patients facing uncertain outcomes. "You know what I learned when I was sick? Sometimes the best medicine comes with 4 legs and a tail." Emma's small hand reached out to stroke Hope's soft fur, her expression serious as she processed this adult wisdom. "Did your dog help you get better?" "My dog saved my life," Michael replied simply, the truth of that statement resonating through the memorial garden like a bell. And now his spirit lives on in dogs like Hope, who will help other kids be brave when they're scared. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Patricia Martinez, the nurse whose compassion had helped bridge the gap between medical protocol and human need during the crisis that had changed all their lives. Patricia had been promoted to director of the hospital's new Department of Integrative Healing, overseeing programs that combined traditional medicine with alternative approaches to patient care. The afternoon therapy session just finished, Patricia reported to Wells, her voice filled with the satisfaction of someone whose work had found perfect alignment with her values. 6 patients, all showing improved vital signs after spending time with the therapy dogs. The pediatric oncology results are particularly encouraging. Patricia handed Wells a tablet displaying charts and graphs that told the story of Rex's legacy in clinical terms: reduced anxiety levels, improved medication compliance, faster healing times, decreased length of hospital stays, the measurable benefits of animal-assisted therapy that had grown from one German shepherd's act of supreme devotion. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the memorial garden, the Thompson family gathered for their weekly ritual of sharing Rex's story with new visitors. They had become unofficial ambassadors for the power of human-animal bonds, their personal testimony carrying weight that medical studies couldn't match. "Rex taught us that love doesn't die," Michael said to a small group of families who had come to learn about the therapy animal program. "It just changes form and finds new ways to heal. Every dog that helps a scared child, every therapy animal that provides comfort to a grieving family. That's Rex's love continuing to work in the world." Sarah added her own perspective, speaking directly to the parents who carried the particular exhaustion of families fighting medical battles. "We thought we were going to lose everything, our house, our savings, our father and husband. But we gained something more valuable, the understanding that love is stronger than fear, and healing comes from the most unexpected places." Jake and Ryan, now young men who had been shaped by witnessing extraordinary sacrifice and devotion, spoke about the responsibility that came with surviving crisis. Their part-time jobs had evolved into a non-profit organization that provided financial assistance to families facing medical bankruptcy, ensuring that other children wouldn't have to sell their possessions to help pay for their parents' survival. As the visitors dispersed, carrying with them information about therapy animal programs and contact details for support services, the Thompson family remained in the garden with Dr. Wells and Patricia, bound together by their shared experience of witnessing a miracle that had transformed their understanding of what was possible. Hope had fallen asleep in the shade of Rex's statue, her small body rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of a creature who had been born into a world where her purpose was clear and her value was understood. She would never know the dog whose sacrifice had created the opportunity for her service, but she carried his legacy in her DNA and her training. "You know what the most beautiful part is?" Wells said, watching Hope sleep with the expression of a man who had found his way back to wonder after years of clinical detachment. "Rex will never really be gone. Every life that Hope saves, every family that finds comfort through animal therapy, every scared child who smiles because a dog sits beside them, that's Rex. Still working, still healing, still loving." The memorial garden held their small group in comfortable silence as the Phoenix sun painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, another day ending in a world that had been made slightly more compassionate by one dog's refusal to let love be conquered by death. 5 years after Rex's sacrifice changed everything, Michael Thompson celebrated his 60th birthday surrounded by 4 generations of family in the backyard of the Scottsdale home they had nearly lost to medical bankruptcy. The afternoon sun filtered through the mesquite trees that Sarah had planted in Rex's memory, casting dappled shadows across tables laden with homemade food, and the particular chaos that came with 23 family members gathered in one place. Hope, now a certified therapy dog whose reputation had spread throughout the Southwest, supervised the festivities with the calm authority of a creature who understood her role as both family member and healer. At 5 years old, she had already comforted hundreds of patients at Mercy General, her gentle presence continuing Rex's mission with the same unwavering devotion that had made her predecessor legendary. "Grandpa Mike, tell us the story about Rex again," called out Emma Rodriguez, Jake's 7-year-old daughter, who had inherited her grandfather's love of animals and her grandmother's fierce determination. She sat cross-legged on the grass beside Hope, her small hands buried in the dog's thick fur with the unconscious confidence of a child who had never known a world without therapy animals. Michael looked around the gathering. Sarah, her hair now silver but her eyes still bright with the humor that had sustained them through their darkest days. Jake and his wife Monica, successful veterinarians who ran a clinic specializing in therapy animal training. Ryan and his husband David, who had adopted 2 children and built a nonprofit that provided therapy dogs to military families. Their newest additions, grandchildren who called him Papa Mike and treated Hope like a furry sibling. "You've heard that story 100 times, sweetheart," Michael replied, but he was already settling into his favorite chair, the one position so he could see both the memorial garden Sarah had created in their backyard and the bronze plaque that marked the spot where Rex used to sleep in the shade. "But it's the best story," insisted Carlos, Ryan's 8-year-old adopted son, whose own experience with childhood trauma had been eased by countless hours spent with Hope and other therapy dogs. "It's about how love can save people." Sarah brought Michael a glass of iced tea, the ritual they had maintained for 27 years of marriage through cancer and recovery, financial ruin and restoration, loss and redemption. Her touch on his shoulder carried the weight of shared history and the particular intimacy of 2 people who had learned that happiness wasn't the absence of struggle, but the presence of love strong enough to endure anything. "Well," Michael began, his voice carrying the storyteller's cadence that had developed over years of sharing Rex's story with therapy animal groups, medical conferences, and families facing their own crises. "It starts with understanding that sometimes the best doctors have 4 legs and fur coats." The children giggled at the familiar opening, but Michael noticed that the adults leaned in too, drawn by a story that somehow revealed new layers of meaning with each telling. Dr. Wells, who had become such a close family friend that the children called him Uncle Harry, sat beside Patricia Martinez and her husband, their faces reflecting the peace that came from lives spent in service to others. "Rex knew things that humans couldn't understand," Michael continued, watching Hope's ears perk up at the mention of her predecessor's name. "He could sense danger before it happened, feel changes in my body that the most sophisticated medical equipment couldn't detect. But the most important thing he knew was that love doesn't count the cost." The afternoon breeze carried the scent of Sarah's roses and the distant sound of children playing in neighboring yards, creating the soundtrack of ordinary happiness that Michael had learned never to take for granted. 6 years of cancer remission had taught him that every gathering, every shared meal, every moment of watching his grandchildren grow was a gift that existed because a German shepherd had refused to let death win. "The night I almost died," Michael said, his voice growing more serious as he reached the heart of the story, "Rex made a choice that changed all our lives. He could have saved his own strength, protected himself, lived longer. Instead, he gave everything he had to keep my heart beating for 52 minutes. Emma's eyes were wide with the particular absorption of a child hearing about sacrifice and love in terms she could understand. "Because that's what families do for each other?" "Exactly," Michael replied, his throat tightening with emotion that 5 years hadn't diminished. Rex taught us that love means showing up even when it's hard. It means putting someone else's needs before your own comfort. It means never giving up, even when the odds seem impossible. Hope had wandered over to Dr. Wells, resting her head on his knee with the intuitive understanding that therapy dogs seemed to possess about which humans needed extra comfort. Wells scratched behind her ears, his own eyes distant with memories of transformation that had begun with confronting his prejudices and ended with discovering his true calling. The remarkable thing, Wells added to the story, is that Rex's sacrifice didn't just save Michael's life. It changed how we think about healing, about the connection between humans and animals, about what's possible when love guides medical care. Jake, who had inherited his father's pragmatic nature but tempered it with his mother's compassion, pulled out his phone to show the group a video from the veterinary clinic he and Monica had opened. The footage showed a golden retriever named Tommy, trained in Rex's honor, working with a young boy who had been afraid of doctors since a traumatic surgery. "This little guy wouldn't let anyone in a white coat near him for months," Jake explained as they watched the child giggle, while Tommy performed tricks that had been specifically designed to reduce medical anxiety. But Tommy helped him understand that healing could be fun, that medical procedures didn't have to be scary when you had a friend beside you. Monica, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics with the analytical eye of someone who had married into a story that seemed too remarkable to be true, spoke up from her position on the grass where she was teaching the youngest grandchildren how to properly interact with therapy dogs. "What amazes me most," she said, "is how Rex's story keeps growing. Every month, we get calls from families who heard about what happened here, who want their own dogs trained to provide medical support. It's like he planted seeds that are still sprouting 5 years later." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a car pulling into the driveway, followed by excited shouts from the children who recognized the vehicle. Out stepped Maria Santos, now Dr. Santos, her veterinary degree complete and her first year of residency at the Children's Hospital behind her. With her came a young German Shepherd in training, part of the next generation of therapy dogs who would carry Rex's legacy forward. "Sorry I'm late," Maria called out, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion and satisfaction of someone who had spent the day saving lives. Emergency surgery on a therapy dog who was injured while protecting his patient. "He's going to be fine, but it reminded me why this work matters so much." The gathering shifted to accommodate the new arrivals, chairs pulled closer together, plates loaded with food, the easy choreography of a family that had learned to expand its circle to include anyone whose life had been touched by Rex's story. Maria's presence represented another branch of the legacy, a career change inspired by witnessing impossible love translate into medical miracle. "5 years ago," Sarah said, raising her glass of iced tea in an impromptu toast, "we thought we were going to lose everything, our house, our savings, our husband and father. We never imagined that losing Rex would somehow lead to all of this. A house full of family, careers dedicated to helping others, grandchildren who will grow up understanding that love is the most powerful medicine." The toast was echoed around the gathering, glasses raised in honor of a German Shepherd who had transformed tragedy into purpose, fear into hope, and one family's crisis into a movement that had touched thousands of lives. Hope barked once, as if adding her own voice to the celebration, then settled back into her supervisory position with the contentment of a dog who understood her place in a story much larger than herself. As the sun began to set over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in the brilliant oranges and purples that made Phoenix sunsets legendary, the Thompson family and their extended chosen family settled into the comfortable rhythm of an evening that no one wanted to end. These were the moments that Rex had fought to preserve. Ordinary happiness made extraordinary by the knowledge of how easily it could be lost and how precious it was to find again. For our readers who have experienced the profound bond with a beloved pet, have you ever witnessed your animal companion display an almost supernatural understanding of your emotional or physical needs during difficult times? We'd love to hear your stories of how pets have brought healing and hope into your life during challenging moments. Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what another family needs to hear today.